So get this. In 1577, a group of theologians created a document they hoped would unify their faith. But instead, it drew a line in the sand so deep it would divide Protestantism for centuries. This isn't just some story about a dusty old paper. It's about a high-stakes attempt to answer one of the biggest questions imaginable. Okay, let's just dive right in. At the very heart of this whole story is this question. It's a question that has echoed through pretty much all of philosophy and theology, right? Is our destiny in God's hands, or is it in our own? The thinkers driving the Reformation absolutely had to have an answer, and their struggle to find one is really where our story kicks off. And right here, you can see the two completely different paths you could go down. On one side, you have the idea that God is sovereign over everything, salvation and damnation. But on the other side, you've got the view that God is sovereign over salvation, but we humans, by our own free will, are the real cause of our own damnation. The Lutherans who came after Luther tried to walk a razor-thin tightrope right between these two ideas. So this brings us to what we can call the predestination puzzle. You see, the early Protestants were seriously wrestling with this. If God is truly in control of everything, but he's also a God of love who wants everyone to be saved, well, how do you make those two truths fit together without something breaking? Now, at the core of this whole puzzle is this foundational idea, sola gratia, or grace alone. For reformers like Martin Luther, this was the hill to die on. It was non-negotiable. Salvation had to be 100% God's work. The moment human effort plays any part, even a tiny one, it's not a gift anymore, is it? It's something we've earned. But, and this is a huge but, this created a terrifying problem. If salvation is totally God's work, what does that say about damnation? Does God also actively choose who is lost? This created what theologians called a split image of God, one face that's loving and merciful, and another that seems, well, arbitrary and damning. This was a full-blown theological crisis. And so, what did they do? They came up with a solution, the formula of Concord. You should really think of it as a theological balancing act, a careful attempt to walk that tightrope between two positions they saw as incredibly dangerous extremes. Yeah, this slide just illustrates that tightrope perfectly. On one side, you had the view often tied to Calvinism that God actively decrees both who gets saved and who gets damned. But on the other side was something called synergism, the idea that our human will cooperates with God and is a deciding factor. The formula of Concord wanted to avoid both of those at all costs. So here's the crucial point. This is how they tried to solve it. The formula made this key distinction. They argued that God's choice to save, his election, is active and totally sovereign. But when it comes to damnation, God is passive. He doesn't decree it. He simply foresees that some people will freely choose to reject his grace. So in their view, damnation is our fault, not his decree. And you know what? At first, this solution seemed like a massive success. We're talking over 8,000 German church leaders who signed on. By 1580, it was made official in the Book of Concord. For just a fleeting moment, it really looked like unity was finally within their grasp. But here's the twist. In solving one problem, the formula unintentionally created a brand new one. It actually set Lutheranism on a course, a kind of slippery slope, that would steer it away from Luther's original thinking and right into a place he probably would have hated. And the seed of this new problem was the very idea they used to solve the old one, prescience, or God's foreknowledge. By putting so much focus on what God foresaw, they opened a door they never intended to. That door led directly to this concept, intuitive fide. It's a Latin phrase that just means in view of faith. And this theory argues that God chooses people because he looks into the future and sees that they will choose to have faith. Do you see the shift? It's subtle, but it is massive. This slide maps out the journey perfectly. It all starts with the formula's idea that God foresees rejection. Then, theologians start to really emphasize this foreknowledge. This slowly develops into the idea that God elects based on foreseen faith. And what's the end result? Well, a foreseen human action, our faith, becomes the reason for God's choice. And that, my friends, is synergism, the very thing they were trying to avoid in the first place. And the confusion was real. This quote about the theologian Johann Gorhard, it just sums it up perfectly. It's the classic chicken and egg problem, right? Does God choose us because we will believe, or do we believe because God chose us? The attempt to hold both ideas at the same time just created a huge theological tangle. So, what did other Protestants think about all this? Well, for the Reformed tradition, the spiritual descendants of guys like John Calvin and Theodore Beza, this internal Lutheran shift wasn't just some interesting trivia. It was a major point of conflict that would end up widening the divide between them even more. And the flashpoint came just a few years later, in 1586, at a meeting called the Colloquy of Montbéliard. This is where the leading minds of the Lutheran and Reformed camps met face to face, and you better believe the ideas from the Formula of Concord were front and center in a really tense and ultimately totally fruitless debate. And this quote, wow, this says it all. At the end of the debate, the Lutheran Jacob Andreas said this to the Reformed leader Theodore Beza. It's just a devastating line. It shows this wasn't some abstract academic disagreement anymore. It was a personal, painful split. They could be civil to each other, sure, but they could no longer call each other brothers in faith. After Montbéliard, that gap became a chasm. Both sides just dug in and hardened their positions. By the time of the famous Synod of Dort in 1618, where the Reformed really solidified their own views, the divide was seen as pretty much permanent. The formula meant to create concord had instead helped cement discord. So where does that leave us? What is the real legacy of the Formula of Concord? Was its position a beautiful, faithful paradox that we should just accept as a mystery? Or was it a fatally flawed solution that was basically doomed to fail from the start? This chart gives us a fantastic final summary. You can see the three positions laid out so clearly. On one end, you have the Reformed view, with its idea of double predestination, that God actively decrees both salvation and damnation. In the middle, you have the formula's attempt to hold two ideas at once. And on the other end, the later Lutheran position that ultimately based everything on foreseen faith. Ultimately, it all boils down to this. The Lutheran defense is to just embrace the paradox as a divine mystery. They'd say the Bible teaches both God's total control and his universal love, and we shouldn't try to use our limited human reason to get rid of one for the other. But the Reformed critique is that this isn't a mystery, it's a contradiction. And they argue that by denying God's sovereign role in damnation, you will inevitably, eventually end up denying his sovereign role in salvation too. And that leaves us with a final question, one that goes way beyond 16th century Germany. When you're faced with concepts that seem to contradict each other, especially about the nature of God and humanity, what's the better path? Is it better to just rest in the mystery? Or to demand an answer that perfectly satisfies our own logic? Now that is a question worth thinking about.